Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix and welcome back to my channel. I encourage you to hit that like button to subscribe for more quality content from Phoenix and to share with your friends. Welcome back to my Philosopher series. Today I'm very excited because I'm going to talk about Plato and Plato's politics, and it will be very interesting to delve into these things. So let's get going. So, how do we think of politics? Well, certainly the way that Plato thinks of politics is different from how we probably think of politics now, but politics is often defined as groups vying for power, groups placing their positions, their political and philosophical positions, into the public sphere, so that way they can gain power. And politics also deals with government and the way that government rules and the way that people themselves rule each other. And so politics is a very interesting thing to consider. There is also the notion of being apolitical, which is where you are disinterested in politics. And the reason why I bring up political versus apolitical is because I'm not really sure where exactly Plato fits on that, what could be called a spectrum. I definitely think Plato is political, and I don't think he would ever use the word apolitical because he very much cares about politics, and he cares about how people govern themselves. I mean, that is the whole basis of the Republic, for instance. But the reason why I posit the idea of apolitical is because there's a little bit of neutrality in some of what Plato has to say. And certainly there are a multitude of perspectives in which Plato engages with in his books. And I think that that is very important to keep in mind. There is the perspective of Socrates, but as you will learn, there is also the perspective of Glaucon, of the Sophists, and all of these other philosophers. Even Protagoras, who you will remember, said that man is the measure of all things, positing a relativistic politics, so to speak. And this is something to consider. So I'm not sure if Plato is necessarily apolitical because he cared a lot about politics and how these things are talked about, and that was why he presented his arguments in his books. But I would say that he was a little bit open-ended in his politics as well. And this makes sense because Plato is a philosopher, and my understanding of philosophy is that it is inherently agnostic as well as neutral and inherently logical. And sometimes politics, as we know from our experiences in the world, are often very emotionally charged. They're often biased. They're often illogical. And while I wouldn't want to express politics as always being bad per se, or having a negative influence on things, I would describe it as being very complicated. So I do like the idea of thinking about Plato's politics as being very much open-ended, in that they are open to discussion, they are open to interpretation, and that we can think very seriously about what is going on when Plato talks about politics. Now, if you'll remember the notion of mimesis from my other video on my Philosopher series on mimesis, where I talk about art and the notion of mimetic distinctions, you will remember that mimesis is very much placing the emphasis on truth rather than expression, that truth is more important such as in art, but also in many other things, and that truth is very much important. And this is a political position, I would describe. So mimesis is always stressing truth over appearance. And so if Plato is saying that the truth is the most important element in politics or in our political world, then he is very much saying that truth is what matters the most. And this actually makes a lot of sense because when you think about Plato talking about the philosopher kings are which are decided as being the most logical and rational of the bunch that are elected to run government, you very much realize that reason, rationality, truth, and truth over appearances is very much the way that Plato would run his society. Of course, this is open-ended. There are many ways that we can interpret this, but I think this is a fair interpretation for where Plato is coming from. And so the philosopher king is very much a rational person who gets to govern society because of that capability. He is the most rational and reasonable person, and therefore he can deliberate about very difficult matters, and he can go into these things in a very interesting way. And you might be wondering what I think about that. Well, it's about to get even more intense because, as I said, Plato talks, or I should say Socrates talks to Glaucon, and Glucon is a character in the Republic who very much believes that people are psychologically egoistic, the term of which is psychological egoism, that people only care about their own interests. And this is what Glucon argues for when he is talking with Socrates. And this is a very interesting thing to think about, because it means that Glucon thinks that when people are trying to vie for power, that is exactly what they are doing. They only care about their own interests. They only care about having their own power for their groups. If you remember, politics is the study of groups to a degree, and the ideologies that underpin those things. And definitely Glucon very much challenges Socrates' notions and does not necessarily think truth is the most motivating factor and the most influential factor for people and their behavior and their ideas about the world. And this is definitely something very interesting to think about. Glucon is not focused on objective truth in the same way that Socrates is. And if you read the Republic, you understand that Glucon and Socrates definitely have a lot of things to discuss and that there is a lot going on. So what do we do with this? What do we do with Glucon saying that if a person was able to get a ring that turned them invisible, much like Lord of the Rings, and Frodo, for example, you are very much left with the notion that these people can do whatever they want. They can sleep with whoever they want. They can steal whatever they want from the market. They can hurt other people in any way and not get caught. And Glucon argues that this is what humans would do if they had the power. And so it is very powerful thinking about these notions, that Plato was thinking about these ideas and trying to understand how people came to their conclusions. And in this perspective from Glucon, there is mostly the human conquest for power, that is the definition of human nature. Now, there are a lot of different interpretations. For instance, I think of Viktor Frankl whenever I think of different interpretations for human nature and the meaning of life, who argued that the purpose of life was to find meaning, and that the purpose of existence was meaning itself. You also have Nietzsche and the will to power, which is that the perspective of Nietzsche is to be better, to cultivate yourself, to become better, and in a sense wield some kind of power due to your self-cultivation. And the notion of cultivation is also similar to Aristotle, who talks about cultivating the self and cultivating our virtues. So there are definitely a lot of ways that we can think about what the purpose of life is. And this is very valid to think about, and it's almost sometimes very difficult to know what that answer is. And the reason I like Plato is because he's looking at all of these different perspectives, and he's looking at all of these things. And while he thinks that truth is the ultimate way in which we should run our government and the way that we should run societies, he still very much is open-ended enough to be able to think about different perspectives. And I find this to be very valuable in philosophy and in politics and in political theory. And the reason is because I think it gives us a different perspective. It gives us a framework from which to view differing points of view. Obviously, one of the fears is that if we are apolitical, then the wrong people get in power and we are not fighting them. And that is a very complicated claim to make, but an understandable one. But I also like the idea that we can be more free and open in our politics, and that we can think about the world in a more open-ended way. So politics doesn't just have to be about power. It doesn't just have to be about these things. So definitely a lot to think about. Objective truth is important, and that is what Plato seems to be trying to discover in his adventures in philosophy. And definitely it's a crazy thing to think about, like what is politics and what is power and what is society and government and how should we live and how should we be governed. Obviously we get a lot of different opinions on this, and again that's why I think Plato's perspective and books are very valuable for at least opening up this discussion. And I myself may describe myself as apolitical, but I definitely understand the importance of politics, so I don't question that. My only thing is that I think that politics can sometimes become too ideological, and I think that Socrates worries about that a little bit in the dialogues. I hope that you enjoyed this talk. I encourage you to check out my other videos on my channel, and I encourage you to stick around for more content. And yeah, I'm Phoenix, and thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. There is much more to come.